Hello, my name is Katrin and I'm a sophomore at Roosevelt High School. This semester, I studied an online course with Harvard University called Ancient Masterpieces of World Literature. We studied ancient texts like the Lusiads, the Odyssey, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, but my favorite one was the Arabian Nights. Now, I'm sure most of you know what that text is. I would like you to close your eyes and picture what you think of when I say the Arabian Nights. Okay, you can open your eyes. You may have had images in your head of genies, Aladdin, or magic lamps and carpets. This is what my perception of the Arabian Nights was too before I studied this complex origin story of the Arabian Nights. Through studying this course and research papers, I learned that European translations of the Arabian Nights have taken away from the original significance of the text. The structure of the Arabian Nights is a frame narrative, which means there's an overarching story of a character telling all of the smaller stories within. The larger story is about a king who gets betrayed by his wife and has a deep distrust of women. He vows to marry a new bride every night only to execute her the next morning. Soon, a high official's daughter named Scheherazade offers to marry the king herself, but she has a plan to stop all of this violence. She tells the king a new story every night, but leaves it on so captivating of a cliffhanger that he can't kill her because he wants to hear the rest of the story. He eventually gets over his hatred and marries Scheherazade. The stories within this collection are about everything from fables and adventures to romances and mysteries. They have influences from all over the Levant, which is an area in Western Asia that includes, but is not limited to, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine. There are also stories that seem to have influences from other places in Asia, like India, and there are even themes present from European literature. The authors from this collection cannot be traced because of the large number of them, the vast area from which they came, and the many additions and changes over time. The reason why Europeans were exposed to the Arabian Nights in the first place and became so obsessed with it is all due to one man. His name was Antoine Galland. Antoine Galland was a French scholar, archaeologist, and translator who was born in 1646. He focused on Oriental studies, which is an academic field that embraces Near and Far Eastern cultures, peoples, and histories. He translated the Quran, which gave him experience in translating Arabic texts. Galland collected stories from many places around Western Asia by many different authors, and they were between 2 and 7 centuries old when he worked with them. The manuscripts he gathered either contained one story or several stories, but the collection as a whole would not have existed if Galland had not put them together himself. The first 7 volumes of Galland's French translation utilized these sources from the Levant, and they were traditional tales. And one prominent source that he used was called Alf Layla wa Layla, which means 1,000 nights and one night, and it was a Syrian manuscript from the 1400s. These first 7 volumes were translated and published from 1704 to 1706. The first volumes of Galland's work became very successful in Europe and people were hungry for more. The problem was that Galland had no more material to translate and share, but he needed to come up with a solution quickly because he wanted to make money. In 1709, his friend introduced him to a man named Hana Diab. He was a Syrian storyteller from Aleppo, and he told Galland 14 more stories to add to his translation. And these stories made up the rest of the book through volume 12. And the stories that you may immediately think of when I say the Arabian Nights, such as Aladdin or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, were not even from the authentic manuscripts. They were told to Galland by Hana Diab, and he completely rewrote them because he was just listening and taking notes. So your favorite stories and the most popular stories in Europe and America were not even written in Western Asia. They were actually written by a French author. There are 3 reasons why Galland's Arabian Nights boomed in popularity and success when they were published. The first reason is that European scholars were determined to confirm the origin, authorship, and literary heritage of the stories. Later translators debated over what they believed the origin was, and many put their opinions in the forewords of their work. Some were convinced the main influence was Persian, others thought it was Indian, But the truth is that it is impossible to trace the exact origins in the Levant and around Western Asia that each story came from. But this search for the truth generated interest and popularity for the Arabian Nights. The second reason why it became so popular is that his work spread around Europe at a time when European literature was shifting from classicism to romanticism. Classicism is based around ancient Rome and Greece and has an emphasis on restrained emotion and simplicity. Romanticism, which is where European literature was heading, has more of an emphasis on exaggerated emotion and imagination. Some Europeans were tired of the formality of classic European literature, so the colorful, mysterious, and foreign life portrayed in the Arabian Nights provided them with an escape. The final reason for Galland's success was his alterations to the stories. In both the tales he translated from the manuscripts and the ones he wrote down from Hana Diab's retellings, he freely omitted parts, added his own words, and completely changed anything he wanted to better suit European taste. Additionally, Galland only took shorthand notes to keep up with Hana Diab's quick retellings. So then later when he went back, he had to completely rewrite the stories just based on his short notes. From Galland's journal from the spring of 1709, we can see that he made many abbreviations and mistakes in his notes to keep up with Diab's retellings. This actually helped the popularity of the Arabian Nights because Galland had to completely rewrite everything, and he wrote it in his own style, which is French European. Now we come to the problems with Galland's work. He was the first person to translate the Arabian Nights, and this collection would not have existed if not for him. But that does not mean that it is perfect. There's always struggles when translating, and there's not really a perfectly accurate way to do it. That something will always be compromised. There might not be a parallel word with the right meaning, or you could compromise the style or rhythmic pattern. Galland was not even trying for accuracy though, so his problem wasn't that translation was hard, it was that he changed and rewrote anything he wanted to better suit European taste, which may have altered the meaning of very specific, important words and stories. He created a beautiful piece of literature inspired by Western Asian manuscripts, written in European style, but he lost the importance of the original texts. It was written by Galland using the traditional European sense of a book, which is one whole work that is meant to be read as a cohesive story. In reality, the original manuscripts contained tales that were completely unrelated to one another. Before they were gathered into a collection, traveling storytellers would retell the individual or small groups of tales from a basic manuscript all around Western Asia. The goal of these oral stories was to amuse and entertain the listeners, so storytellers would modify or add to their copies of the basic stories in response to the audience's reactions. The very personal method of telling the stories one-on-one or to a small group was very much like the frame narrative story that was later added. In this piece of art, you can see Scheherazade telling the story to the angry king, with the same goal of entertainment that the traveling storytellers had. The order and details of small groups of the stories were constantly being changed with every individual retelling. This is how the tales were meant to be told, because it was folk literature passed down from generation to generation. One person's version of a story may be completely different from another person's version, whether it be on paper or in their head, and that was the beauty of the dynamic and ever-changing literature. The original purpose of the text was ruined when Galland put the stories into one collection. This set in stone the order of the stories, and stories that usually would never be told together were now in one piece of literature. The freedom of the text was lost, and the stories were not even preserved in an authentic way because Galland rewrote them in his own European style. Antoine Galland's edition was reprinted more than 30 times from 1810 to 1885. From his work, the Arabian Nights was translated into English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Dutch, Icelandic, German, Greek, Swedish, Russian, Polish, and Hungarian. Now I know that sounds like a lot, but today it's probably even more because the Arabian Nights has only grown in popularity. Most translators based their work off Galland's work, but some of them went straight to the source, back to the original Syrian manuscripts. Different translators focus on different things. For example, Sir Richard Burton was trying to get the most accurate translation that he could, but in doing so, he was forced to use archaic or made up words because he couldn't find a word with the right meaning, and this made it kind of difficult to understand. Edward Lane, another translator, wanted to convey the importance of understanding Western Asian life, so he added footnotes in after every chapter to explain everything to British readers, but they were lengthy and rambling at times, so no translation was perfect. According to Professors Martin Puchner and David Damrosch, the teachers from my course, at Harvard University, there were about 40 stories in the original Arabian Nights by Galland. The number 1001 Nights, which is another name for the Arabian Nights, you might know, is just to represent a huge, seemingly infinite number of stories. They're not actually 1001 stories for the 1001 Nights, but some people later added more stories in an attempt to get to 1001 stories. The Arabian Nights did not just stay in adult literature. The main plots were simplified down into children's stories. There were musicals and plays created. And of course, Disney's Aladdin is a popular example of a movie made directly from the story in the collection. There have also been movies for some other stories from the Arabian Nights. There was a movie for Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves in 1944, and a movie based on Sinbad the Sailor in 1947. Additionally, there is a ballet called Scheherazade based on the storytelling queen from 1001 Nights that premiered in 1910. The style of the Arabian Nights was so much different than classic European literature, much to the liking of many people because it was a break from the formality, but it could not fit into an existing genre. Orientalism is the representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, in a way that exaggerates Eastern culture and ways of life in an attempt to portray the East as an exotic world of beauty. A new genre was created to fit the Arabian Nights based on Orientalism called Romantic Orientalism, Oriental Exoticism, or Oriental Fantasy. Europeans invented the idea of the Orient as a foreign place of mystery, fantasy, and magic. The literature in this genre represents the European intrigue in this made-up, faraway place. A translator of the Arabian Nights, Sir Richard Burton, wrote in his preface, "Once more I saw the evening star hanging like a solitaire from the pure front of the western firmament, and the afterglow transfiguring and transforming, as if by magic, the homely and rugged features of the scene into a fairyland." This is just one example of the fantastical style of writing that translators used to create this image of a beautiful and exotic world. Additionally, this shows how authors liked using these magical words to draw readers into the aesthetic of the Orient that they had created. This romanticized, inaccurate representation of the East includes exaggerated and dramatic characters and emotions that can promote stereotypes about people. For example, in some versions of Aladdin, when Jasmine reaches to get an apple from a merchant's cart to feed a hungry boy, the merchant grabs her arm and cuts off her hand. On the table that he cuts her hand off, there's slashes indicating that this is a commonly used punishment. Reading this can cause people to draw incorrect conclusions about Eastern people. They may generalize them as barbaric, lawless, or oppressive to women, none of which are true. And this is not only offensive, but it may cause a harmful stigma around Eastern people. Additionally, Black people are falsely depicted in many stories from Galland's translation as intellectually and physically inferior, so there's many stereotypes in the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights is like a book of fairy tales. Although it may have been inspired by authentic manuscripts, the meaning of the stories and characteristics of the people have been so misconstrued over time and over all of the translations that they are now essentially fictional works that can't be taken seriously. People from Western Asia are often confused why the Arabian Nights is so studied and loved in Europe and America because to most people there, it is considered unworthy literature. They see it as low-quality writing full of offensive stereotypes. If it is so obviously not authentic to Western Asians, why do people from Europe and America think it is so accurate? The problem arises when Western readers see it as anything other than fictional fairy tales. If they take it as ethnographically accurate and authentic information, then they accept these stereotypes as the truth and they might promote them. In addition to the exaggerated stories in the collection, some of the original stories were not even from Western Asia, which lowered the authenticity even more. Some of Hannah Diab's tales that he retold were versions of European tales or had lots of European influence. For instance, The Two Jealous Sisters, a tale from the Arabian Nights, has similar characters and plot to a story called Lancelot, King of Provence, by an Italian author and poet. Additionally, in European literature, the motif of a flying horse is very prominent in many stories, and the plot is centered around that motif in The Enchanted Horse from the Arabian Nights. Europe's obsession with the Arabian Nights spread to America and has become ingrained in our culture. There are appearances of the tales everywhere in our literature and art, from children's books, musicals, and plays to even movies. Many people think that the books that we have that are based on the Arabian Nights are authentic and classic pieces of Middle Eastern or Western Asian literature, but they were actually manufactured and mainly written by European translators and contain just an inspiration from the authentic Western Asian stories. Despite the inaccuracy, the Arabian Nights is revered by many prominent European and American authors. Voltaire did not attempt to write fiction until he had read the Arabian Nights 14 times. Apparently, Stendhal hoped that Allah would remove the Arabian Nights from his head so that he could enjoy reading it for the first time over and over again. Elements of the Arabian Nights, such as the extravagant descriptions, are present in Edgar Allan Poe's fiction. The floodgates were now open for Western scholars to study the East because of the great interest generated by the Arabian Nights. Scholars began collecting manuscripts of Eastern folklore, and they were studying the cultures, religions, languages, and customs of the Eastern world more. There were also many more travelers to the East that were scholars because they wanted to write about their experiences in the different cities and countries of Western Asia. From my course about ancient world literature and my readings from scholars who studied the history and effects of the Arabian Nights, I learned just how much influence this text had on Europe. Scholars created a new genre just to fit this book. Common readers had this newfound interest in this magical, fantastic place, and they loved this new literature that was so different from their original literature. And people just wanted to travel to this beautiful place that they had read about. There was so much new intrigue and interest in this foreign, fantastical world, but there were also new stereotypes. Because of the exaggerated and dramatic traits of the characters, it was easy to draw conclusions about Eastern people and generalize them as these huge characters, because that's what they had read them as. Although some beautiful writing came out of the translations, the alterations of the stories repeatedly through translations by Europeans also took away the point of the original works. The first translation by Antoine Galland locked down the details of what was supposed to be a freely changing and adaptable story. Then later translations and adaptations of the book simplified, changed, or added to the stories, so now they are even less authentic than Galland's writing. Some modern scholars have recently recognized that the Arabian Nights was influenced by the biases of translators and authors. More people are starting to recognize the adaptations that are supporting and promoting preconceived notions and stereotypes about Arab character. Some even view it as a frivolous text because it cannot be taken seriously. I would agree that it cannot be considered an accurate representation of Eastern people, and it is more like a book of fairy tales, but I don't think it has zero literary worth. The Arabian Nights is a great example of how much literature can change over time, and it is interesting to think about the purpose and meaning of the stories in the beginning and how different they are today. I hope that from this presentation you have learned that European translations of the Arabian Nights have taken away from the original significance of the text. It is easy to read a book called The Arabian Nights and assume that it is accurate and authentic to the Arab world and Western Asia, but you have to understand the history of the text to really see its path of development and all of the different influences. Literature is not a static type of art. It changes and adapts over time. Sometimes that is for the better, but sometimes it can take you away from the original beauty and purpose of the text, like in the case of the Arabian Nights. Thank you.